whenever we see a villain in a movie or we read about one in a book, or even when we see a real life villain on the news, we rarely think, wow, that could be me. In fact, we usually think, wow, that could never be me. But here's the thing. No one grows up wanting to be the villain. No one makes it their life goal to be the bad guy. No one starts off as a child wanting to be the evil one. But when we watch, when we read, or when we see the stories of the villains and what led up to the actions that earned them the villain title, we can see patterns in their behavior that led them down that road. And so for you and I, we have to be careful. In fact, we have to be intentional to not let those patterns develop in our own lives. In fact, you can think what you're doing is what a hero would do and not realize that it's leading you to becoming the villain. Because here's the thing. There is a little bit of villain in all of us. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be taking a look at the lives of different real life, these guys actually lived, villains that were talked about in the scriptures, in the Bible. And my hope is for us that not only do we have a little bit of fun, because I hope that we're going to have a little bit of fun, but that we would all become a little bit more familiar with some of the Bible bad guys. And also that we would see how easy it is for anyone to fall into the trap and become the villain of their story. So before we get started, how I want to do is today we're not going to be talking about any specific villain today, but today is kind of the introduction to the series. It's going to kind of set the foundation for all of the villains that we're going to talk about. But today I want to talk about this interesting dynamic that happens to all of us. It's something we all experience. So this is you and me. This is us. And the one thing that we all have in common is that sometime in our lives, for a lot of us, we've already experienced this. For some of us, we're going to experience it in the future. In fact, probably for all of us, at some point in the future, we're going to experience it again. And some of us are experiencing it right now. But all of us will have things come up against us. Bad things that'll come up against us. Now, sometimes these bad things come because of a decision that we made. And that decision that we made is causing these things to push up against us. Because we made the decision to go to this place we know you shouldn't have gone. We made a decision to take that drug. We made the decision to hang out with those people or to borrow too much money. We made a decision, and now the results of that decision, our own decision, is pushing up against us. Of course, sometimes it's not our decision, but it's an action that someone else takes against us. It's not something we instigated. It's something that came from someone else. It might be somebody's angry words that we could never let go of. It might be a physical attack. It might be the way that someone has treated us in a relationship. It might be an injustice that we feel that someone did to us. And that pushes up against us in a negative way. Or it might not be some decision that we made and an action that someone took against us. It might just be life's randomness. Because sometimes things happen and they just seem very, very random, like there's no control over them. So we have a fire and there's a forest fire and it comes and it wreaks havoc in our community, maybe in our own home. Or we go through an earthquake or a hurricane. Sometimes we get news of a disease that comes upon our body or that of somebody that we love. And so it's not like it's anything that was planned or anything that someone instituted against us, but it's just the randomness of life. And when we experience these influences, when they come and they push up against us, there's this interesting dynamic that happens. It actually pushes us to this place where we have become a victim of these forces playing on us. Sometimes it's one of them. Sometimes all three come into play at the same time. And we've all experienced what it's like to be a victim of our own foolishness, a victim of someone else's selfishness, or even a victim of life's unfairness. And when we have these external factors that push up against us, people usually respond in one of three ways. The first way is that they become victimized by something and they remain a victim. They just remain in that spot of being a victim. And you may know people like this because they will always tell you about the ways that they are being victimized. They often feel like what's happening to them is just unfair. They often feel like that they're being singled out, like everyone else is fine, but it's them that's being singled out. Like the world is conspiring against them and just them. And every conversation you have with them always seems to go back to talking about how hard life is. They see the blessings of other people, but they don't see the blessings in their own lives. They don't see anything coming to themselves. And they blame other people for their situation. And no matter how hard they try, their situation never changes. And so they just remain with this victim mentality, and you know who they are because no one likes to hang around a victim. Now, a second response is that a person transitions from becoming a victim to becoming the hero. Now, of course, there are some people who do not have to experience that victimhood pressure to be a hero, but oftentimes heroes start as victims and they transition into this hero mode because they want to save people from suffering the way that they suffered. They don't want people to experience that. And maybe in part of them is trying to get a little bit of redemption for their own suffering. Batman is a classic example, right? Batman saw his parents murdered as a child, and so that is why he became the Caped Crusader. He became the symbol of vigilante justice because he saw a wrong and now he set his life towards trying to make it right. But someone with the hero mentality will often swoop down on a suffering victim and do whatever they can to save him or her. And sometimes we think of that and we think, wow, isn't that a good thing? Isn't it a good thing to come down and to save people, to rescue people? Well, sure, but the problem arises when all the hero cares about is saving the victim. Not what's best for the victim or how best can they be the hero for the victim, just the act of saving the victim. It's what psychologists call the hero complex or the savior complex. The hero doesn't see the need to get the permission from the victim to save them. In fact, the hero may not go in and even consider the safety of the victim, their own safety, the safety of others. They are willing to place themselves and even the people they care about in danger just so that they can perform that act of rescue and feel like the hero. I remember there was a television show, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was a show about flawed superheroes. And one of them was faced with this scenario where there was a fire in the building, and he had to put out the fire. And there were people in the building. And so what he did was he used his super breath, and he froze the building to put out the fire. And he stood there so proud that he had saved everyone from this fire. The problem was when he froze the building, he also froze all the people that were in the building, and so they all died. He used his power to solve the problem, to be the hero, but it cost other people their lives. Now there's a third response. The third response from being the victim is that the victim, and this is the easiest transition, where the victim transitions to the villain. The victim to villain transition is very natural. When the victim gets tired or fed up with staying in the victim stage, they begin to plan. They begin to start to strike back. They begin to plot their revenge. Victims, when they become aggressive and violent, start to move towards that villain state, and they don't care what other people think of them. In fact, they actually find a sense of control when other people have fear of them. And part of the danger of the villain response is that it doesn't just turn on like a light switch. The transition from victim to villain is often very, very slow. It builds up over time. In fact, the victim rarely realizes that they have become the villain. The victim often thinks that they are actually transitioning into the hero. And so we look at the victims that we know in our lives and in culture. We see Hitler and Darth Vader. We see Khan and Voldemort and the Joker and Dr. Evil and Lord Farquaad, right? We see all of these victims, and what we tend to do is we tend to make the villains into caricatures of people. Like they're not real. And yet every one of us has the capacity to be a villain. And you might say to yourself, well, there's no way that I would ever be a villain. But when our anger gets the best of us, that is the response of a villain. Whenever we feel like we want to hit back, push back, make them pay, that is a villain's response. And we see this in our day-to-day lives. You're driving on the highway, someone cuts you off, and what do you want to do? You swerve out of the lane and you speed up to try to cut them off. Or your neighbor allows his trash to blow into your yard, and so you pick it up and you start to fling it back into his yard or her yard. You're standing in line at the grocery store, the guy in front of you clearly has 15 items in the 10 items or less line, and so you're desperately trying to catch the eye of the cashier so you can look down and kind of let her know or let him know that this guy in front of you has too many items and needs to get kicked out. Right? All of these actions are things that many of us do every day. But they're the first steps down the villain pathway. It's where it starts. Now, in a typical Hollywood plot, the victim, villain, hero triangle is always present. It's always there. It's always about good triumphing over evil. But the question for us is as followers of Jesus, is what does that triangle look like? What do these dynamics look like to a person of faith when it comes to our faith? Because as followers of Jesus, we understand that there is an ongoing battle between good and evil that is played out every day. It's played out every day in the world. It's played out every day in our lives. In fact, when you look at almost all of the world religions, the major world religions, they all believe in this good versus evil paradigm. And that we should be proponents and instruments of good triumphing over evil. So what I want to do with the rest of our time today is we're setting up ourselves for what's going to happen over the next few weeks as we talk about these different villains. I want to talk about a fourth response, a fourth option in the victim, hero, villain trilogy. An option that can help us not just escape the victim, villain, hero cycle, but that allows us to help others who may be trapped in it themselves. And that fourth option, the fourth response, is the response of the guide. Now see, the guide might have come from and be influenced by all three. The victim, the villain, and the hero. The guide might have all of those tendencies, but the guide always looks to Jesus. The guide always looks up and points the victim to Jesus, points the villain to Jesus, points the hero to Jesus. And we're not guiding people to Jesus simply because Jesus was a good man. And that's really easy to do because, the world doesn't argue with that. The world will say, yes, we agree, Jesus was a good man. And as long as you say that Jesus was just a good man, you can have a good life. Just by following the teachings of Jesus, if that's what we say, you won't have any problems with the world. They'll go right along with you. As long as you say he was just a good man. But if that's all he is, then he's long gone. And what can he do for us today? We have to believe that Jesus is who he said he was, who he said he is. Who he is who he said he is. That's what we have to believe. So what I want to do is I want us to look at three things that Jesus said. Three statements he made. Three things that we have to remember when we feel ourselves falling into getting stuck in one of these categories, or when we have an encounter with somebody who is stuck in one of these categories. Three things to remember, three things that Jesus said, three reasons why we should guide people to Jesus. Now, first of all, with the victim, the main problem of the victim is the victim says to himself or herself, I am carrying everything by myself. It is all on me. It's all up to me. I'm the one who is the only one that can get me out of this, and I don't have the ability to do that. And the victim gets into this cycle where it seems like they're just always trying to push because everything is coming against them, and they don't get any kind of peace because they're always fending off the attacks that they see coming at them. One day Jesus is speaking to a group of people, and he's talking about how life for them could be different if they would just look at the things that they endure in life from a different perspective. Listen to what Jesus said. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. See, it is not, I will relieve you of the burden, right? He's not saying, I will necessarily remove the burdens from you. But what he's saying is that I am going to take those burdens, and in spite of those burdens, I am going to give you rest. Rest in the middle of handling all of the burdens. Now, listen to what he says next. He says, take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Now, it's an interesting thing because he's using this word yoke, which kind of has a double meaning. In that time, a yoke was referred to a tool, an implement that oxen would wear to tie two oxen together so that they could pull a heavy load. And what Jesus is saying is, it's not that your load is going to be less. He's saying, when you put my yoke on you, and it's you and me bound together on this yoke, both of us are pushing. And I am going to take the heaviness out of that burden so that you can go at a pace that you can manage, right? So we can move together. I'm going to be the one that's going to make up the difference in the strength that is needed to move your burden forward. And when you do that, you will find rest for your souls. Now, that word souls is actually the translation of it in the Greek means not just that thing in you that makes you who you are, but it is your entire self. Body, mind, spirit is what the soul is in this verse. And Jesus says, for my yoke is easy to bear. And the burden I give you, the burden that you're going to carry when we're walking through this together, the burden I give you is light. What Jesus is saying is that when we are tempted to play the victim, we have to remember that it is Jesus that gives us rest for our soul. The second response is the response of the hero. And the problem of the hero is that the hero says to themselves, I can do everything by myself. I can do it all. I am the one that has the strength, the intelligence, the resources, the money. I am the one who can come in and I can solve not only my own problems, but I can solve everybody's problems. I can go in and fix situations on my own. The problem with that is that when we start to think that we can do everything on our own, that we are only reliant on ourselves, not only does our pride get in the way, but our pride has a tendency to push out of our view what is best for other people and always see what is best for ourselves. And so Jesus wants us to remember that everything you have, everything that you think is yours, your talent, your ability, your resources, your education, your wisdom, your experience, that didn't come from you, that came from him. This is what Jesus would say to the hero. He would say, I am the vine, you are the branches. Right? I am the one with the roots, you're the one that is an extension of who I am. Those who remain in me and I in them, if we continue to be connected, will produce much fruit. There's going to be a lot of things that you can do, but it's because you're connected to me. He says, for apart from me, you can do nothing. He says, anyone who does not remain in me, in other words, anyone who snaps off from the vine and just off by itself, you've seen this, right? Anyone who does not remain with me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Because that's what happens when you detach the branch from the vine. It dries up because its source of power is gone. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. In other words, they're worthless. But Jesus says, but if you remain in me, and my words remain in you, you may ask anything you want because we're connected together, and it will be granted. Now, a lot of people have taken that verse to mean, oh, well, as long as I am a Christian and I go to church, I can ask Jesus for anything and he will give it to me. No, that's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that if you are connected in, then the things that you ask are going to be the things that Jesus asks. That's kind of one of the ways you know that you're connected in, because if everything that you're asking for is all about you, you're probably not connected in. But if everything you ask for is not just for you, but for the good of your family, of your job, where you work, of your employees, of your employers, of your colleagues, of your classmates, of your teachers, of your friends, of the community that you live in, when that is what you are looking for, then you know that you are connected in. And those things Jesus will give you. So when you and I are tempted to play the hero, we have to remember that Jesus is the source of true strength. And then we come to the villain. The villain who, well, their main problem is they say to themselves that I can only get justice by myself. I am the only one that can set things right, and I don't care who I hurt, and I don't care how much it hurts other people. I don't care how many innocent bystanders are affected by this. The important thing is that there is justice, and I am the one who has to get justice. It has to be me. And Jesus says, no, listen, you're looking at life different. You're looking at life in the wrong way. That's the way the world works, and look at what's happened to the world. And Jesus says, I want to show you a better way. I want to show you a better way of getting justice. Listen to what he says. He says, but to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. And that's so countercultural. It's so different than what culture is telling us today. Today, culture says that if there is somebody who you think that they might hate you, it's time to shut them down. It's time to do it. It's okay to do as much evil as you want to them because of their hate for you. But Jesus says, no, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. He says, bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. He says, if someone slaps you on the cheek, one of the most offensive things that you can do to a person, offer the other cheek also. And if someone demands your coat, and he's saying this into a culture, not like ours today, where we have to have a coat closet for all of the coats that we have. He's saying this into a culture where if you were fortunate, you had one coat. And he's telling them, if someone demands your coat, offer them your shirt too. Again, in a culture where they oftentimes had one shirt. And Jesus is saying, if they're asking for it, if they demand it, give it to them. Jesus says, give to anyone who asks. And when things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. Not do to others what they have done to you. Not do to others what they deserve because of what they did to you. Do to others as you wish they would have done to you, as you hope they would do to you. Do to others what in your mind, if you could map it all out, this is how they would behave towards me, that's how I'm going to behave towards them. Jesus goes on, he says, love your enemies. Now, it doesn't say you have to hang out with them, right? But you have to love them and do good to them. And Jesus says, then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will truly be acting as children of the Most High. And then listen to what he says. For he, Jesus, is kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. And see, this is Jesus' way of saying, listen, remember, you at one point were unthankful. You at one point were wicked. Maybe you right now are unthankful. Maybe you right now are doing wicked. And Jesus' response to you and me in our unthankfulness and in our wickedness was not revenge, it was not payback, it was not making us suffer the way that he suffered. His response was kindness. He's saying, listen, you need to be kind to people in the same way that I was kind to you first. That's what your response should be. When tempted to play the villain, we have to remember that Jesus responded to us with kindness. And he still does. He responds to us with kindness. Not with punishment, not with anger, with kindness. So in the story of your life, in the day-to-day actions that you take, what are you intentionally or unintentionally, what role are you auditioning for? What role are you preparing for? What role do you want to play? Do you want to play the role of the victim? A lot of people love the role of the victim because they get pity from people. They get attention from people. Do you want to play the role of the hero? A lot of people love playing the role of hero because they get all the accolades. They get all the compliments. People speak good words to them. They feel like they're admired by everybody. Maybe you want to play the role of the villain. Like you know how to make people change. You know how to get back at them. You know what they deserve and you know how to give it to them. But listen, when we feel like the victim, we don't need to look to Batman or the Avengers or to Shrek or Captain Kirk to come and save us. Let's look to Jesus, the only one who can save us and the only one who knows everything about us, knows us by name. When we feel like we want to be the hero, when we want to put on the cape and swoop down and rescue everyone, then instead of doing that, let's look to Jesus and remember that we are completely helpless apart from him. And then when we feel tempted to act like a villain, which comes up in our lives more often than we would care to think, let's remember that revenge only tastes good for a little while, very, very briefly, and only at the beginning. But it quickly sours and it quickly becomes bitter. So let's look to Jesus, because Jesus is the only one that is just. He's the only one that promises a reward from blessing those that curse you and praying for those that hurt you. He is the only one that offers true justice through kindness. And he's the one who responded to us first with kindness. How can we respond to others any differently than he did? So instead of being the victim, of staying the victim, instead of trying to be the hero, instead of getting our revenge as the villain, instead let's take on the role of the guide. Let's take on the role of the guide, and in every situation that we find ourselves in, no matter if we feel a tendency to stay in victimhood, to move to hero status, or to try to get back at the world as a villain, let's look to Jesus instead in every situation. And in every encounter with someone who is going through that, who finds themselves trapped somewhere in that trilogy, then instead of encouraging them where they are, let's point to Jesus. The Jesus who can pull them out of victimhood, who can rescue them from the need of being the hero, and who can take them and shower them with so much grace and mercy and love that their response will take them out of wanting to be the villain and want to respond the way that Jesus did, with kindness. That's what Jesus offers us. Jesus wants us to not be any of these things, but to be a guide that looks to Jesus and a guide that points others to Jesus. And I think you'll see as we go through over these next few weeks and talk about the different bad guys in the Bible, that if they had just made that decision to point to Jesus, to look to Jesus, things could have turned out very, very differently. Not just for them, but it's for us too.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.